Once upon a time in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a queen sat sewing at her window, which had a black frame of ebony wood. She sewed. As she looked up at the snow, she pricked her finger with a needle. 3 drops of blood fell into the snow. The red and the white looked so beautiful that she thought to herself, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood in this frame. This is from the beginning of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, as written by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. I got this from the University of Pittsburgh's website. They had the original text on there. And I thought this was a good way to start the speech about fairy tale origins. And I think that we all know how classic fairy tales are. They always have a moral. They always have the hero winning at the end of the story. Those kind of things like that. And I really think that the history of fairy tales is surprising and fascinating because it will surprise you about how the actual story was written originally. And then also the age of these stories is a very interesting topic as well because they're a lot older than you think they might be. The first point of age in these stories, I found an article on the BBC News called A Fairy Tale Origins, Thousands of Years Old, Researchers Say, which I think is kind of an interesting title because I feel like that title is very indirect. And so I'm not sure I like the title of the actual article, but what's in it is kind of interesting. They found that Beauty and the Beast was about 4,000 years old. They traced it all the way back to that time era. Also, Rumpelstiltskin was about the same age. So that kind of makes you think 4,000 years old. That's pretty old, but they did one that I've never heard of, but the only reason I'm actually kind of including it in this speech is because it was over 6,000 years old. It was the oldest one they found, and it was called The Smith and the Devil, which actually kind of has, I think that it's been spun off a little bit. We all know The Devil Went Down to Georgia, those kind of things like that. So this whole sense of the Smith and the Devil is kind of ingrained in some of our fairy tales that we use today. But it was actually from the Bronze Age, which the Bronze Age was named the Bronze Age because we started putting copper and tin together to make things like shields, swords, those kind of things like that, but also tools. So it was the very start of metallurgy, and I think that's kind of interesting because the story is about a man selling his soul to the devil to have the ability to weld metals together. So to have that ability was probably pretty awesome in that era. Today we probably feel like that wasn't necessarily such a thing. So I think that's why we've kind of converted this into like The Devil Went Down to Georgia kind of thing, where he gets the fiddle of gold if he wins at the devil's contest. But if you think about that, 6,000 years ago, I mean, we're getting kind of the point where written language is not nearly as done as much as it is today, or even later that time. So a lot of these stories were actually passed down orally, which is kind of interesting because I don't know if you guys ever played telephone in grade school. And the whole premise of telephone is that you go ahead and tell a secret to the person next to you. The other person does the same thing. You go all the way around the class. By the time you get back to the last person, they actually have to tell what they heard from the other person. And typically, it's nothing like the actual the story that was happening at the very beginning. And so I think that that's something that really kind of converts these stories a little bit. But the other thing, too, is these stories were actually meant to scare children at first, but then over time they actually became a method to just warn them. One example of that is Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel is still pretty bleak, but the other part of that is that Hansel and Gretel came from a time in England that people would actually be cannibalistic because there was too much famine and stuff like that. And I got that from the Huffington Post article true stories behind classic fairy tales. And so the actual origin of these stories actually become a little bit more of a fascinating part of this. In that same article, Cinderella's wicked stepsisters, at the end, well, kind of the climax, I guess, would be the best part. They actually mutilate their feet in the original tale to actually fit in the glass slipper. And because there's blood in the slipper, the prince knows now that this person is not the person that he danced with the previous night. So that's been taken out. It's been watered down for children. The other part of that same story is when Cinderella actually marries the prince, the wicked stepsisters come to see the wedding, but their eyes get pecked out by birds in the end. So the end is a little bit more horrific than what we've kind of grown up with. And I think that the Cinderella that was just played actually kind of has a pass back to that, and that kind of thing like that. It was just enacted by Disney. One other one that really struck me in this article was the dwarves in Snow White. Dwarves. In the time that it was written, actually the dwarves referred to children. And these children would be forced to work in the mines. Well, the problem with this is that if they're children and they're working in the mines, they actually they actually have deformities and stuff like that. So they were called dwarves because of their deformities. So that's a little bit more horrific than what we kind of grew up with, where these kind of magical creatures actually bring Snow White in. And yeah, they do work in a mine, but they're not horrifically disfigured or anything like that. A little bit of change, a little bit of watered down for children. The other interesting thing about that whole plot of the story is that Snow White gets poisoned by an apple. Well, in that same time frame, these dwarves would they would steal a lot because they're starving and stuff. They don't make enough at the mines and stuff like that, so they actually would steal from the merchants, and the merchants would actually poison them sometimes with apples, whatever was available. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and it's very fascinating to me about the previous part of this. So the history of fairy tales is surprising and fascinating. And it's surprising how old some of these tales are and how the origins of these are fascinating. But, I mean, if you really think about it, in 100, maybe 1,000 years, what do you think is going to be the next fairy tale?